If it's after 2:15, it won't be going towards us. And right now, again, we still only have 425, and that is not going to show that Women's Magazine and feminism is important to our listeners. So we really need at least 5 people to call or to go to kpfa.org, 1-800-439-5732. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Rod, for at the controls.
We got to go.
We got to go.
You're listening to 94.1 KPFA, 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online at kpfa.org.
Well, that takes us just past the top of the hour here at KPFA. My name is Brian Edwards-Tiekert. Normally I'm on the air live at 7 a.m. And as part of our fundraising efforts, we're going to bring you one of our favorite interviews from that time slot. And the book that we're discussing will be in the featured box at kpfa.org if you'd care to pledge for a copy. Hope you like it. You're listening to Upfront. I'm Brian Edwards-Tiekert. One of the remarkable things about Elon Musk is not just that he is insanely wealthy, nor that he appears increasingly deranged, but the fact that he is so publicly deranged. Most of society's wealthy keep their lives private and their public images, if they even have one, carefully managed. In politics, they let their money do the talking and they let their proxies do the work. When you have extreme wealth, you can afford privacy. And when you want to keep extreme wealth, probably best not to flaunt it. Inequality breeds populist backlash, but when the wealthy keep themselves out of the spotlight, it is easier to get that backlash redirected at immigrants and trans people and any other scapegoats that are readily at hand. Our next guest dedicated himself to lifting the veil and redirecting the attention on the people behind it. Rob Larson is a professor of economics at Tacoma Community College. He is house economist at Current Affairs magazine, and just out with the book, Mastering the Universe, The Obscene Wealth of the Ruling Class, What They Do with Their Money, and Why You Should Hate Them Even More. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Brian. My pleasure.
I'm confused by the carefully neutral language in your subtitle. How do you really feel about the subjects of your book?
People feel like my message, often doesn't come across. And anyone who's read my writing will know over subtlety is a major problem in my writing style. So we tried to avoid that with the excessively long subtitle this time.
We should probably start with definitions and analytical frameworks. When you talk about the ruling class, who do you mean?
Yeah, so talking about the ruling class, obviously, the first thing is, what you're referring to, and it is a contested term, of course. So for me, when you talk about the ruling class, you're looking at the people in or institutions in a position to rule a society, to decide what might happen in the future in your society. And what you're looking at there is sort of two domains. Like first, of course, you have the realm of the state and government decision-making and government policy, which of course gets a lot of attention because it's the public sphere and everyone knows there's a president and the Senate, and they make important decisions, and state level policy is important as well. But additionally, what people forget about is the other segment of the ruling class, which is just the absurdly rich families who not only have this dramatically disproportionate share of the country and indeed the world's wealth, as well as its income, of course. But I would stress this also make up the other half of the ruling class, because the other half of it would be decisions made in the business world, in the private sector, and CEOs and corporate boards of the great global companies of today. They're the ones making the investment decisions. So as much as government shapes policy that creates the legal framework for future events, so too do the giant companies with their investment decisions, which decides which industries or which part of the economy are going to get money and which will therefore grow and become part of the economy of the future. So when I talk about the ruling class, I'm usually looking at those very wealthy, very high status families that have participation in the highest policy forming levels of the state, or especially in the corporate world, where those investment decisions to move production to another country or start selling way more pills than a town can justify and hook everyone on fentanyl. And we should just say, we can refer to this, we can return to this as well, should remember big corporations, they do answer to someone. They have owners, they have their investors and stockholders overwhelmingly, those are those same rich households. So your wealthy households that own the elite corporations and that staff the policy-making arms of the government. To me, that's like what the ruling class sort of refers to.
Yeah, one of the ironies of political discourse is a lot of the people who think central planning is a political abuse of state power when it is practiced by the government have no problem practicing central planning within the corporations they control.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is an amazing thing when people talk about, oh, economic planning, governments, and all their unintended consequences. Oh, you think you'll get development, but it's all going to go wrong. Governments can't do it, and you need the endless responsiveness of the free market to fix these problems. It is amazing because you look at today's private sector, and it's filled with just the biggest corporate empires you can imagine. My last book, Bit Tyrants, was on the big tech firms of mostly my state and yours, Washington and California. And those firms, we're talking about like Microsoft right now at this moment is the biggest firm in the world by capitalization. It's a $3 trillion corporation. So things that company does are entirely based on corporate planning. I mean, they respond to market signals, of course, but internal to the firm with its data centers and its storage warehouses for its Surface tablets and so forth. It's an insane amount of planning that goes into keeping the supply chains, bringing in the raw materials and stocking those and shipping the products out. The amount of corporate planning that goes on in the economy is pretty extensive, especially in today's marketplace where most markets are, as we economists say, oligopolies. So monopoly, you have a single firm that dominates a market, and we still have plenty of them. Oligopoly is where you have a small number of giant firms, 2 or 3 or 4 enormous companies. Most markets have that now. Any market where you can name the big 2 or the big 3 or the big 4, that means you're looking at an oligopoly. And that just means in today's huge economy, you're looking at gigantic entities that, do planning every quarter to maintain their big, complex business models and their profit centers and keep those things operating to satisfy Wall Street investment analysts. The amount of planning that goes on is incredibly extensive, but the private sector is where most of it is and where it has least visibility, ironically.
How do you distinguish between the power of people who are wealthy or control corporate wealth and the power of people who are in government? Like Joe Biden's not poor, but he's not wealthy enough that he controls the means of production or, allocates the assets and investment decisions of a Fortune 500 company. He does, however, control a nuclear arsenal.
But I think that's a great question, how we define the power of, the wealthy versus, senior government figures. So that's a great question. I mean, just the nature of power and who gets, who holds power, who gets to make the decisions that will shape the world of tomorrow. That's one of the most important questions when you're studying any society, and certainly ours today. So if we look at different forms of power and different levels of it, power, the ability to make things happen in society, to make people do things you want them to do or prevent them from doing things you don't want them to do. I tell my students all the time, there's all kinds of social power in society. If you obviously run the state, you have power. You can pass laws, you can tax people. If they don't follow the laws, you can put them in jail, or you can draft them into your military and invade another country. That's popular. So that's power. But obviously, if I have the corporate power to close down all the industry in the American Midwest, that also comes with a certain level of social influence. And if you're a big employer, or if you run today's big productive capital, your manufacturing plants, agricultural estates, oil refineries, data centers, what we call, as you said, the means of production, the big physical capital that we use to make all the goods and services and that we all work in every day. It's a very different kind of power, but it's very real. So one thing I always that I refer to in the book, if let's say you're a megalomaniac, and I'm sure we have some of them in the audience. You're obsessed with yourself and your own power, and you want to become a big, powerful person. There's lots of ambitious people who like power in the world. Okay, we have a number of options to pursue that. You could, for example, take up, or pursue, and maybe eventually get a senior position in government, and maybe you're a senator or even a president. You'll have real power in those positions. There's no doubt about that. But it's like a very specific power. Like it's constitutionally defined, and even with the power creep of institutions these days. There are real enforced legal limits to what you can do. On the other hand, if you're a megalomaniac and you just decide to become rich, there's no limit there. I mean, you can get as many dollars as you want. There's no limit to the natural numbers, as we say in math. So you can accumulate a fortune and there's no ceiling to it. And you can become a multiple hundred billionaire. We have a couple of those these days, which is pretty stunning. And that's the crucial thing. There's no limit to how much you can pile up fat stacks, as they say. So as a result, if you pile up enough tens of billions, you can come to America and buy or build a giant TV network. And you call it Fox, and you completely change the political landscape of the most important country in the world forever. That's got to be power. You can be the world's dumbest billionaire, Elon Musk, and I include Donald Trump in that. You can be the dumbest billionaire in the world, but because you're so wealthy, you can bring in capital from your awful rich cronies in Wall Street and Silicon Valley and Saudi Arabia and buy Twitter. I mean, X. You should always say it the way Elon thinks the name, I feel. And when he bought X, he was able just to, as we all saw in real time, borrow money and then try to back out and get forced into buying it and then be the worst, most pathetic tyrant to ever rule a media platform. Say what you will about Michael Bloomberg, Rupert Murdoch, and George Hearst. Like, at least they had the evil dignity of a Succession main character, and they rule their empire with a scowling detachment. Elon Musk goes through the pain of his divorce every day on Twitter, I mean X. So there's a lot of different forms of power there. But I would just say, if you want power, you can get it in the government, but there's going to be real lines drawn around the power of your office. Whereas if you're a billionaire, buy the media that shape the ideas that people hear. Have your own space program. Put unknown hundreds of millions into electing your awful billionaire friends. It really opens up a lot more, I would say, different avenues of power, being a wealthy person or a wealthy household versus simply being in a Senate seat where you get to have, maybe you're sitting on an important committee and you have to run again in a couple of years. Oh, what a pain. Just be a evil rich billionaire. There's very little to check your authority there except for your awful billionaire peers that you compete with.
Well, in theory, state power is a check. Historically, the very wealthy have feared expropriation, regulation, incarceration in the case of a revolution. How are today's ruling elite different? What's their relationship to the governments of the world?
When you get capitalism in the Western world, like modern industrial capitalism, it's the late 19th century, late 1800s, and you get these huge, millionaire, monopolistic figures like John Rockefeller and Carnegie and JP Morgan and so on. And they just completely dominate the state in those early days. I mean, you have cases where the early railroad barons, remember, this is back before you had cars and highways, railroads were how goods were moved between states, basically, and people mostly. Back in those days, they would literally just, these millionaires or their staffs would just appear on the floor of the New York General Assembly or other state legislatures and just appear with literally valises full of cash or stock in their monopolies to make the state senators investors in your monopoly. Great way to bring them over to your side. Then, of course, you get the giant labor explosion through the CIO in the 1930s and big socialist movements in Western Europe. And you go through World War II and you come out with people who really want social democracy. And we start taxing the rich at very aggressive levels. People may have heard of the very high marginal tax rates, which only apply to the very, very highest fortunes, of course. But all the way through the 1950s, the top tax rates in the U.S. were in the 90s of percents. So basically, you could only earn so much money, and then further money after that is almost entirely confiscated.
Although importantly, that's taxes on income, not on wealth.
Very important distinction. Yes, we're mostly referring to income taxes and related, transactional taxes. That is a very important part of that story. But that is where we got the money for all the great victories of what people now look back on and call America's golden age, building the Golden Gate Bridge and the interstate highway system and the Hoover Dam and putting men on the moon. How do we pay for all that? By taxing the DuPonts and Rockefellers of that era is how that was accomplished, of course. But then, of course, you do get the 70s, high inflation, people kind of losing the memory of the Great Great Depression, and they're willing to have enough sympathy for Reagan and Thatcher to come in and take apart a lot of those progressive taxes and also the regulations, which played a major role in keeping those wealthy households corporate property, doing at least a little more competing on an oligopolistic level rather than just doing naked monopolistic plays and rent seeking and so on. So the nature of the state as a check can be very limiting or very enabling for the rich, but depends on what those of us down on the bottom are able to keep it doing. If you don't have the threat of a labor movement going on strike, or the ability to keep senators in that won't stock the Supreme Court with Citizens United passing right wingers, then we're going to lose the ability of the state to limit the reach of private power like we had in the New Deal, and we'll be where we are today, where the government, if anything, only helps their dominance.
It seems like implicitly you're talking mostly about the U.S. government. Certainly the Chinese state, the Russian state, don't seem to have had much trouble bringing their own billionaires to heel in recent years.
Indeed. And it is an interesting picture because if you look at Russia and China today, and I have small sections on those countries in the book as well, every country these days has a horrible, rich ruling class and a 1% that owns between 30 and 40% of its wealth. That's true in essentially every region of the world today. But they'll have their own unique, weird characteristics. And in Russia, your oligarchs just explode up with the privatizations of the Soviet Union. And then that's Putin's whole original way of coming into power, was putting some leashes on the oligarchs' just complete naked looting of post-Soviet Russia. Like that's his origin story. China's is interesting too, because China, you do nominally still have a Communist Party state. It remains very authoritarian. You got all the negative aspects of Maoism. But it has the richest legislature in the world right now, China. It's People's Assembly it's richer than the U.S. Senate even, which is a flex, I would say, for the Chinese ruling class, but they're very much more integrated into the state. You do still have a very centralized state hierarchical apparatus in China, even compared to other authoritarian states like Russia or, the Saudis. And so they're much more integrated. If they get too big, like say Jack Ma, you'll take him down a peg, but he's still a billionaire. I mean, there's a limit to how much you'll get in trouble there. There, it's about keeping them in the process. And because China has so much state industrial policy, which has a mixed record, but a lot of successes over the last few decades under its belt. I think that's a strong argument you can make. It keeps the billionaires very much within the process there. But again, in their place. I mean, when Jack Ma started making, a lot of moves with his giant Alibaba platform and started implying that it was its own force in China, that is when he suddenly disappears from the press for a few weeks, and we learn that there's a new CEO of the firm who's closer to the presidency there. So all these countries have their own weird way that the power of the private and public sectors relate. Typically, they overlap, and it's seldom to the benefit of the rank and file people in that country.
Right, but it seems to be an important distinction between insanely wealthy people who profit off their relationship with the state and insanely wealthy people who create independent sources of power with which they influence the state. The political independence is not really tolerated in Russia or China.
Indeed. And here in the U.S., you have plenty of both of those. Situations where, the fortune comes directly from just feeding off the public trough. And you have ones that are, like the original wave of the big tech platforms. Although even there, I mean, Google and Amazon would never have been able to build their fancy online platforms if it hadn't been, of course, for decades of public investment creating what, the backbone for today's internet and web, which was mostly paid for by was mostly done through the Defense Department, through DARPA and the National Science Foundation and some of the research universities, and paid for by our parents' generation's tax dollars primarily. But it's true, though, there are companies absolutely, once you have that big public good of the internet being paid for and developed, it's true that their firms run independently. They mostly, there are exceptions, like Google and Amazon sell lots of cloud service to the Pentagon for the war cloud and other demonic sounding things. But broadly speaking, it's true. Their profit center is in the private sector. It's within the marketplace. But then you also have figures, like Boeing, which is entities like Boeing, which is very big where I live in the Pacific Northwest, or people like Elon Musk. And those entities rely almost completely on public money, on for Musk, it's subsidies for his EVs and government orders for his space company. And Boeing, I mean, of course, has a large private, airline, commercial jet manufacturing business, but its most profitable industry remains defense contracts. So there's plenty of both, but because of the hugeness of modern states and their big responsibilities, even if you are an entity like Amazon or Google that got huge through network effects and other just straight private market phenomenon, once you're big and you have an oligopoly on some big technology like computing as a service, it just becomes irresistible that you start hogging up some of that public funds, I guess.
That's the voice of Rob Larson. He is a professor of economics at Tacoma Community College, also the House economist at Current Affairs magazine, and just out with the book we're discussing. It's entitled Mastering the Universe: The Obscene Wealth of the Ruling Class, What They Do with Their Money, and Why You Should Hate Them Even More. The book includes a lot of data that he pulled from investor reports, from the real estate ads in the print edition of the Wall Street Journal, where you will get hit with one mansion that has hit the market after another. It also takes you through a ton of history, the stories of the 19th century robber barons, how they built their fortunes and what they did with them, and some kind of case studies in the balance of power between the private sector and the state. He is a big fan of the illustrativeness of the Treasury crisis of 1894, when J.P. Morgan bails out the government twice on terms he was basically able to unilaterally impose, even though the first bailout was extraordinarily unpopular. The then president of the United States still had to come crawling to him. He walks you through common lies and myths, for instance, that the wealthy are job creators rather than people who profiteer off the labor of others, and has a takedown of philanthropy as mostly practiced by the obscenely wealthy in America, how it works as a form of reputation laundering, also fails to really address social problems, and certainly fails to redistribute wealth. The philanthropic entities set up by 19th century robber barons still get wealthier and wealthier with each passing year. They have created self-perpetuating puddles of wealth with advantageous tax treatments. The book is full of charts and graphs. He even has maps of common private jet itineraries, because FAA data is something that you can pull. And it is yours for a donation of $12 a month or $120 all at once at kpfa.org or 1-800-439-5732. That's 1-800-HEY-KPFA. I have a lot more of the interview to bring you, so I'm not going to belabor the point. I am just going to deliver one piece of news before we go back. We have been given a challenge from two of your fellow listeners that is a very high bar for us to meet at this time of day. Jim in Sonoma and Melanie in Katati are willing to double $1,000 if we can raise $1,000 to match them. Now, as of the second, we have raised zero. No surprise there. It's the first time I've asked. Also, we have a grand total of 0 callers on the line. Since we have so much more of the interview to bring you, I'm going to go back to it and hope for the best. In about 15 minutes, I'll let you know if we've made any progress on the challenge. Again, it's kpfa.org, 1-800-439-5732. Any amount will help. $12 a month gets you the book. Let's continue our conversation with Rob Larson. Where do today's fortunes come from? How much of a through line is there from those 19th century accumulations of wealth?
The answer is you get different things. So if you look at like the Rockefellers today, or the DuPont heirs or something like that, these are names that were like mega wealthy households in the late 19th century and the 20th century. Today, those families are still rich, but they aren't stinking rich like they would have been. One in the book that I read for the research process on this book referred to, used the example of a younger Rockefeller, like one who turned 18 like 10 years ago when that book was written, and how he excitedly went to his New York wealth management office and was stunned to learn he was getting $1 to $2 million only. Like a mere $1 to $2 million. Stunning money, of course, to you and me. I can't imagine what I should do with that much money because I'm working class. I don't know what I would do. I work for a community college. I work for money. But that's like, to them, that's like an incredibly disappointing amount. That won't buy a single yacht, let alone one with a helipad and a IMAX theater in it or something like that. It won't keep you in the lifestyle to which you have grown accustomed as a citizen of the ruling class. So these fortunes, they dissipate over time as the family loses its stock ownership control over the company it founded, like DuPont Chemical or ExxonMobil in those cases. And also just the growth of the family, just the growth in the number of heirs as each generation has a number of children. Just mathematically, it's inevitable that those fortunes get diluted. But the value of the wealth in the companies that those families founded, that doesn't go anywhere. That stuff stays in the marketplace, like, stick with Standard Oil and the Rockefellers, for example. In the 1910s, we broke up Standard Oil, which was a Western hemispheric oil monopoly. Again, that's more powerful than the president. That's about as powerful as it gets. Broke that up in the 1910s, but just into an oligopoly. So instead of Standard Oil, for the U.S., you get Standard Oil of California, which became Exxon. The pieces of today's energy oligopoly, they're just large chunks left over from the breakup of Standard Oil, just like Verizon and today's AT&T were both pieces of the original AT&T that was broken up in 1981. The last time we broke up a big company was AT&T about 40 odd years ago. It's been a minute. So like the wealth remains there. It's just going to be wealth for that class of rich stockholders rather than directly in that same rich family.
Let me flip it around. What are the meaningful differences between the ruling elites formed in the robber baron era and the ones formed in the tech baron era?
There are, of course, inevitably, you've got similarities and differences. To have a wimpy answer, that is always the case. So the similarities are kind of what's most striking. Gigantic fortunes starting in the original people who found the firm, and that could be Bill Gates or Rockefeller back in those days. Bill Gates compared himself to Rockefeller frequently, and he even read Ron Chernow's famous, gigantic 900-page Rockefeller biography, which is a great read, but an exhausting one, let me tell you, because he saw himself as that figure. Like, yeah, he was great. He did all this work and made this huge empire, and he was rich, and everyone was mean to him. Just like poor me, Bill Gates. This is when his antitrust case was happening in the 1990s, of course. So like that similarity is there. Super rich oligarchs, their tendency to buy media is the same. So Jeff Bezos, of course, bought the Washington Post for a tiny amount of money. Elon Musk for an insane amount of money bought Twitter. That's still with us. It's like a lot of similarities are there. And the other one I would mention is the turn to philanthropy. Because when you realize that you've got some oil baron that controls the energy system of your country, or a computing baron who controls the networking infrastructure for your country, they tend to look like villains because they're also rich, powerful people, and they do villainous things. You lose touch with what it's like to be a regular person, and soon you're surrounded by an inner circle that just kisses your ass. So of course you lose touch with reality. But why does everyone hate you? It's so unfair. Well, peel off 1 billion from your pile and start a foundation in these days. Back in Rockefeller's era, it was about giving money to churches or universities, which were brand new things in those days in the United States. These days, you put a foundation up with your name on it. Today's tech founders are many of them are like that, like Bill Gates, for example. But many of them are just like hideous will to power libertarian scumbags who see themselves as the great Ayn Rand creators. And we're all grubby parasites who are in their way and trying to, out of jealousy, get shares of their wealth by taxing them and stuff. So I would say today's billionaires are, I would say just on a basic level, like you do see a lot more just like awful amorality, power, but just the same power mongering as they ever had. I think now it's less of a old world way of justifying their wealth. Now it's, I'm a billionaire. I gave $1 to philanthropy. They'll make a movie with a character who's similar to me and he's nice. So it's a little bit more of I don't want to say a nihilistic version of the ruling class, but it definitely has changed.
It seems worth footnoting that the foundations that were set up with those 19th century fortunes, they're giant self-perpetuating piles of wealth. Right. They are a way of exerting social control and or social influence and keeping the wealth consolidated without it being taxed away by estate taxes or capital gains or so forth. The Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Foundations are not like shrinking over time as they spend down the money they inherited.
No. It's so confusing. I heard they were going to give away all their money, and they're still rich and have billions. I must have misread that. But of course, yeah, that is the case. And it's the thing about a lot of these financial entities. It's like the money makes itself. Once you have a large enough amount of capital, I don't want to oversimplify, but you hire some wealth managers, and even if you just buy index funds, capitalism, the market usually grows. Like the money makes itself, even though these people talk like every day they're going out remaking their fortunes again. It is not the case. But also, yeah, that's a good way of putting it too. Like foundations and this whole philanthropic drive from the super rich ruling class. It really is a feature of social control, because part of the reason these guys are so rich is because of all the tax relief that they received from the Reagan, Bush, and Trump administrations. And as a result, not only do they have the huge money to do philanthropy to the extent they feel like it, but also it means the public sector has huge deficits and we have to cut back on public health and things like that. If I recall, Mike Davis, the late socialist author, he pointed out that from the 2008 financial crisis until COVID hit in 2020, over those 12 years, across the US states, you had major budget austerities. We went through the brutal recession that followed that huge financial crash of 2008, to the extent that, if I recall correctly, the United States had 40,000 fewer public health workers at the advent of COVID than it did in 2008. So like the wealth of these guys and their ability to do policy through their philanthropy is just a mirror image of the financial starvation of the state and depriving it of the ability to do constructive social policy, with the difference being that governments are actually at least nominally accountable to everyone in the country, unlike the foundations, which do whatever they want. And additionally, we, the public, have at least some influence over what the government does through the republic and through backlash and so forth, whereas foundations really do have a free hand. And I will throw in, too, if you ever know any wealthy people, I mean, the first thing they try to do as they age is to structure how they dribble their money out to their inheritors, like their kids, so that they can keep controlling them. If you talk to wealth managers who deal with like very high-end households managing tens of millions of dollars in assets or more, it's a very regularly recognized goal that people managing their money don't just want to give their money to their kids when they die or when they're incapacitated, because maybe it'll make them go nuts, and also just because maybe they'll do something I just don't like. So you dribble it out over time and you attach conditions to it. And if you don't finish school and get a bachelor's degree, you won't get this much. If you don't go into the family business, you'll only get this much. And the term that I heard from one financial analyst, I talk about this in the book as well, the term that he used to describe this, the way that these families, these rich families, can partially control their kids even after death through controlling how they have access to the money that they had through that fortune that they created. The term that they use for it is a dead hand. Like a dead hand. Even though I'm dead, with my undead hand, I can control you through the entails and conditions I put on how you'll inherit your fortune. Whereas dead hand, is a term from industry. Like if you're a tractor operator, if you have a stroke or die, if you're not constantly pushing down on a pedal, it turns off the machine, so you don't run over people. That's the dead hand. Even if you die, the machine turns off. Here, the dead hand is, even if you die, you can still control your children through the money. So that self-perpetuating capital really is, it really is a enduring feature of how these people treat their wealth.
It seems like an analog for the super wealthy in general. Right, even though they have the multiple mansions and the mega yachts and the private chefs and so forth, they are not spending down their fortunes. Spending and consumption is an incredibly tiny fraction of their wealth. Mostly their wealth exists to exist as wealth, as a source of power, not as you or I think of our savings, which is as something to be consumed by the end of our lives.
It's true, because just that wealth itself is an asset. Yeah, you can borrow against it. I mean, for the really big billionaires, that's how they get most of their liquid cash flow, is just by getting low interest loans against their gigantic fortunes, because often they're tied up in stock or in other investments or something like that. So like that is the case. Like the fortunes themselves, they have their own income generation, and they come with their own social prestige. I mean, he's a billionaire. If you say like, are you going to follow the orders of someone who is a billionaire or someone who had $1 billion and then spent it? Having that wealth is that source of your, not just power, although definitely that, but your social cash and your prestige, and very quickly it becomes part of these people's identity too. Of course, I'm so successful, you would say. I'm not so evil, undeserving rich. I'm successful. I'm very prosperous. I have, huge fortunes. I remember Steve Mnuchin, I mentioned in the book, took umbrage when some financial journalist pointed out that his annual income was equal to that of the annual incomes of 20,000 nurses. Real money there. And so they get annoyed when you point that out, of course. But also, I always mention this too to my students, with these huge fortunes, just bear in mind, anyone that rich, and not just rich, also if you're powerful, if you're a senator's aide or something, or if you're just famous, if you're just some big rock star or something, if you're rich, powerful, or famous, very quickly, everyone around you is just someone who kisses your ass all the time and tells you how great you are and every idea you have is good. Anyone who criticizes you is just jealous or they're haters or whatever. So just think about what that would do to your brain after a couple of years. Everyone tells you you're great. No one ever criticizes you. You would lose touch with reality. And that is what happens to these wealthy or powerful people, when Elizabeth Warren, who I'm not really a fan of these days. I was a fan of her as an economist. I don't like her as much in the Senate. But when she was during the 2020 presidential race, when she humiliated the media billionaire Mike Bloomberg on stage by talking about his outrageous undeserved fortune, it's a great moment. People should watch that on YouTube, of course, because it's just great to see these guys. He doesn't get mad. He doesn't have a reaction. He's just stunned. If you look at him, he's just he has the look like he's seeing the return of Jesus or something. He's just completely baffled. No one's criticized that man to his face in 10 years. And so you just lose your ability to have your daily human humility and give and take with other people that most of us have to have because we're interacting on relative equality with other people. And if you say that you're a genius, someone will say, prove it, dummy. And you'll go, oh yeah, can I? And it puts you back down on earth, But the ability of these fortunes to grow sort of on their own, is well documented, and it has all these psychological effects on people. Piketty himself even pointed out that the bigger the fortune is, the bigger even its percentage rate of growth, not just its absolute growth, but its rate of growth is, because it can attract the most and bespoke attention from financial managers and get the best terms from them. And he did it in the simplest way by just comparing Harvard's gigantic endowment with more modest ones from some state colleges and universities, and found it didn't just have a bigger absolute return, of course, because it's some $50-odd billion endowment, but a bigger rate. So the bigger your fortune is, the easier it is for it to make money for you that you can then take credit for as your ego expands beyond the ability of anyone to talk to you.
Which part of his argument that there's just a secular long-term trend towards increasing inequality.
That's right. And it's kind of goofy too. That is correct. Yeah. Piketty's theory, there's, we can get deeply into all these different models for why we get wealth and income inequality on such a drastic scale these days. You have the Marxist model of exploitation, and you have more conservative models of just building value over time. Piketty's, is purely mechanistic through an empirical model about how the rate of the accumulation of capital in fortunes exceeds G, the value representing the growth of the economy. And if your fortune does indeed, as he suggested, grows faster than the economy, even if you're an idiot and don't do anything canny or value creating as an investor or business operator, your fortune will grow faster than the economy, which means your wealth grows relative to the society. And it's kind of goofy because if you look at people reviewing Piketty's book and they've never read it, it's not subtle. It's a long book. I read it twice. It was a lot of work 2 times. But people who criticize that book call it a conspiracy theory, which is amazing. It's a pure mechanistic empirical rule. It's there's no conspiracy in it. There's not even any parties in it with agency. It's just something that we see. So it goes to show how little people want to be attached to the real economics of this. But people should be brave. You should read economics books. It's important. You might like them. Some of them are fun.
The voice of Rob Larson. He is a professor of economics at Tacoma Community College. also House economist for Current Affairs magazine. We're discussing his brand new book, Mastering the Universe, The Obscene Wealth of the Ruling Class, What They Do with Their Money, and Why You Should Hate Them Even More. Real quickly, we're trying to raise money while we are the interview. We are offering the book for a thank you gift of $12 a month to KPFA or $120 all at once at kpfa.org or 1-800-439-5732. If you donate right now, we can also count that donation towards a $1,000 challenge put up by two of your fellow listeners. It's a chance to make your donation to KPFA go further, to give more to the station than you're digging out of your own wallet. As of this second, thanks to donations that have come through from Daly City, Sparks, Nevada, and Walnut Creek, we have raised $600. We have $400 to go, and we are about to jump back into the interview. So, if you're interested in the conversation, the book is the first thing that pops up in the featured box at kpfa.org when you hit the donate link, or you can ask for it over the phone, 1-800-439-5732, or just pick the biggest amount you can put towards KPFA and say the thank you gift is KPFA. $400 to go. We're going back to the conversation with Rob Larson. I guess I should bring it around to politics before I let you go. We seem to be in the midst of this wave of populism, some left-wing populism in U.S. politics, pretty well controlled within the Democratic Party, but it's expressing itself in a way it hadn't previously in my lifetime. The Republican Party seems to have been completely taken over by Trump's brand of populism, which is scapegoating immigrants, trans kids, and anyone else other than the country's wealthy. What do you make of it? More importantly, what do we do about it?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question too. These questions are too good. I would say there's a number of things to say there. I mean, first, yeah, with populism, usually there we're just talking about like what rank and file voters have a lot of enthusiasm for. And so we talk about Trump on the far right or Bernie Sanders on what we consider our far left. We refer to them both as populists, even though they have on a lot of subjects just diametrically opposed policies. So it kind of shows that the term itself is more of a term of style than about like describing political units.
Both positioning themselves as the opponents of elites who are in control. Except in Bernie Sanders' case, that is the wealthy people who are actually in control. And in Trump's case, it's, I don't know, people he doesn't like.
It's migrant caravans that are in charge.
Right. Migrant caravans, news anchors, and like anybody who says a mean thing about him on Twitter.
Yeah, if you're a news anchor and you kiss his you're great. You're Tucker Carlson. You're the only real journalist. It's true. Like when you look at it, that is actually a good way of putting it. Yeah, Sanders says the elites are hedge fund owners and tech CEOs, actual elites. And for Trump, it's like illegal immigrants, people who are on the bottom of the global power and wealth hierarchy. I mean, you might be a poor person in the developing world and your life is bad. At least you have a place where you live and you can survive. If you're an illegal migrant, like you are at the bottom. I mean, you know, in Libya, since we destroyed it, those people are people who are migrating extra legally. You know, they're dying at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. They're getting enslaved in literal slave markets. European Union countries are paying North African states to like just dump migrants in the Sahara rather than allow them to try to reach Italy and wait tables. So it's amazing, to see the different, like that is really the question, of course, as they like to say online, are you punching up or punching down? And with Sanders, you're saying we have elites. I'm punching up at them. With Trump, it's we have elites. So let's punch down at these incredibly penniless migrants. And yes, I'm also very concerned that a kid might question their gender identity someday. That's elites. Just like anything that conservatives are alarmed by, that is elites. So vote for me, a real estate billionaire TV celebrity. Again, very elite figure normally. But this stuff only works on the right because it is a fact that in the 1990s, and I don't like saying this, but it is a fact that the Democratic Party kind of abandoned the working class under the Clinton administration, primarily, above all, by signing by signing NAFTA, which to a significant extent really, really opened up and made it easier for big American manufacturing firms to move production overseas. In Mexico, in that case, we had many succeeding agreements since then, like GATT and the WTO, that really helped these firms move overseas, and it destroyed the bargaining power of labor, played a major role in destroying labor unions. And of course, Clinton also got rid of most of the traditional welfare program, deregulated banking, gave media tech companies a complete free pass on their content. Great legacy of the Clinton administration there. But that opened up the possibility for conservatives who have always been the party of the country club and the wealthy elite to say, we're the ones who really represent you because we support you having machine guns that you give to your kid to blow up a school. So that's like populism. We also are just waiting for a chance to take away your Social Security for when you're old or disabled. But don't focus on that. Here's $1 of child tax credit, huh? Pretty good. So it's a pretty twisted political landscape these days. Yes, it is true. What we can do about it, obviously, that's the thing I talk about in the last chapter of the book, is trying to go through this. We have hopeful countercurrents these days for a change. And as much as they're weak and getting the hell beaten out of them right now, 20 years ago, we didn't even have these things, any positive countercurrents. So, for example, these days we have actual socialist national level political representation, obviously through Sanders, of course, and through the members of the House that they call the Squad. It's been very painful over the last few months watching several members of the Squad, these African-American socialist representatives in the Congress, getting knocked out of office in insanely costly primaries, not even by their traditional enemies in the Chamber of Commerce, but by AIPAC and the ethnic cleansing lobby. So that's been tough to watch, but at least we have some team members if you're on the left economically, we're on the board at least. Maybe we can bring them back in the next primary. That happens not infrequently, So that's important. Another important thing, more important really, is that we have at least we could say a renaissance in labor these days. I don't know if it's quite a resurgence yet, but it's at least some recovery. And we have a couple hundred Starbucks that have unionized staffs. Most of them do not have collective bargaining contracts yet, but they've at least gotten through a successful union election. We have, real surprising victories, like the UAW's victory in that auto plant in the South in Tennessee. That is not nothing. And even having one organized Amazon workplace, even if Amazon, of course, follows the traditional employer playbook in refusing to play fair and recognize and negotiate in good faith with that union, its existence is still a significant achievement. And the fact that Americans are just seeing labor organization so much more positively than they did even 15, 20 years ago. Those things are really, really favorable trends on our side, along with people being more open to policies, like Medicare for All, which, if I recall correctly, has the support of 88% of Democrats and about 2/3 of independents, and even a little over 50% of Republicans. Those are popular, socialist-ish. I mean, they do involve expropriating the insurance industry and some of the hospital and drug industries. So you could say it's a real socialist program. Incredibly popular. And it's just because we had a candidate that was willing to talk about it on national TV. So I hate to say it, but we just need to put more of our time as personal activists and individuals and citizens into trying to organize our workplaces, trying to get more progressive political representation in. I mean, it's so difficult to struggle with the amount of money that the Supreme Court has allowed to be spent in our races. But from what I can see, those things remain the main tools that we have for getting real constructive political change. A big part of that, too, is having independent media like Pacifica and the magazines I write for, like Current Affairs and Jacobin, and independent book publishers. Those things are a huge deal. I mean, that's how many of us get politicized in the first place and realize that there is some life outside of the political range that CNN tolerates. Those things are a big deal, And I would just say, our big goal, maybe finally to finish, should be learning the lesson of the New Deal. With the New Deal, we taxed the rich very aggressively for some time. And did a lot with the money that benefited us. We regulated them pretty intensely, but we never took their wealth away. We taxed their income aggressively, no doubt, but we left most of their giant fortunes relatively intact. And above all, we let them remain in possession of that corporate equity. Like they continued to own the corporate world. They kept their ownership of the big capital, the means of production, as they used to say. And so when the 80s came, there's a fatigue with government. People kind of like Reagan's message. They see their moment and they can move their intellectuals like Milton Friedman, who I also wrote a whole book about. They move those, entities like Friedman and Hayek, into media. Friedman gets his PBS show, which is an amazing thing. And you can, but the rich were able to do this big push of putting their messages out there, buying media and making them more right wing, pouring money into politics, and eventually gaining control over the Supreme Court. All that happened because we left the resources in their hand during the New Deal. We never, as we say in economics, expropriated their productive capital. We never said, why are you and your jerky company in charge of the oil refineries in this country? Why do you own all the land that makes our food for consumption and export? Why do you get to own TV networks that shape the ideas people hear and don't hear? Like, if at least there should be some public input into the decisions made by these entities. And that's what expropriation means. It means to take that property away from the private sector in some way. Maybe that's a nationalization. I myself tend to like just straight socialization. Maybe you have widespread unionization in your economy, and then you do some big sit-down strikes in a coordinated manner, and you do a general sit-down strike. Like, that's how you expropriate properties, by making rich people realize if we don't let them have the factories, they won't leave us with a single mansion to hang out in. And that's a big distinction. I think if we had done some of those things in the 40s and 50s, when the social democracy had its big popular push after World War II, we could be living in a very different reality these days. And the only thing I'd like to finish with expropriation is just to say it worked great the first time. Like the one time in the United States where we did a big, major expropriation of wealth, we did one of them. In the 1860s, with the Emancipation Proclamation, when we took away wealthy Southerners' valuable slave assets, just because we decided that they're people with rights and you shouldn't be able to own and sell them and sell their kids off if you want. Like, that's the biggest expropriation we ever did. My view, we should just continue that to the other forms of property that still give the rich the ability to rule over us.
All right. Rob Larson, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, man.
Rob Larson is a professor of economics at Tacoma Community College. He is house economist at Current Affairs magazine, and his new book is Mastering the Universe: The Obscene Wealth of the Ruling Class, What They Do with Their Money, and Why You Should Hate Them Even More. That book, our featured thank you gift for the 9 minutes left in the hour at kpfa.org or 1-800-439-5732. It's just out, and would send you a copy for a donation of $12 a month or $120 all at once. kpfa.org, 1-800-439-5732. And we could really use your help. Partway through the hour, we received a very generous challenge from two of your fellow listeners, $1,000. We started out strong. About 15 minutes ago, we had raised our first $600. And then in the past 15 minutes, we have raised nothing. Not a call, not a web pledge, not $5 and a good luck wish in the comment box. So we are still $400 away from making that challenge. The only difference is now we are less than 8 minutes away from it expiring. So, kind of a now or never moment. Your radio station needs the help. You've got a chance to make what you can contribute go further. And if you've enjoyed the conversation, you can pick up the book. kpfa.org, 1-800-439-5732. That is 1-800-HEY-KPFA. Oh, there's a caller. Thank you. No idea how much they're donating. So it's probably not $400, which means we almost certainly need your help to get the rest of the way there. Rob Larson's book, you can probably pick up on this from our conversation. He is, in addition to being an economist, a rather gifted communicator, gifted in the sense of he is good at communicating concepts from the academy in plain English to those of us who do not have PhDs in economics. And he does a few different things in the book. He takes you through some of the history of old money in California, the fortunes that were assembled during the late 19th century, the so-called robber barons, the last Gilded Age. He goes through kind of historical episodes that illustrate his theory of who actually holds power. For instance, the Treasury crisis of 1894, when the United States doesn't have enough gold to back up its currency, runs to the banking magnate J.P. Morgan. He bails out the United States on terms he dictates. Proves incredibly unpopular. There is backlash in the press and with the public, and the crisis does not abate. And basically, the president has to go back on bended knee to J.P. Morgan again and accept much the same terms, even though they have proven wildly unpopular, because J.P. Morgan, the banker, has more power than the president of the United States. He estimates the carbon footprints of the wealthy ruling elite in this country. Some rather astonishing figures. Crunches together a bunch of public data for the purposes of putting together flight maps of private jets and where they travel. He's got charts, he's got graphs, he has a whole lot of figures and quite a lot of narrative. Data pulled from investor reports, from the real estate ads in the print edition of the Wall Street Journal, which is where you list your penthouse, apparently. He also walks you through common lies and myths, for instance, that the wealthy are job creators rather than the people who profiteer from the labor of others. Is a deep critique of philanthropy and a whole lot more. The book, Mastering the Universe, The Obscene Wealth of the Ruling Class, What They Do with Their Money, and Why You Should Hate Them Even More. $12 a month or $120 all at once. kpfa.org, 1-800-439-5732. All right, the donation has come through from that phone call. We are now $100 closer. Thank you. That means $300 to go. Yikes! 4.5 minutes left on the clock to raise it, and we're at 0 callers on the line. Look, the reason that you're able to hear a conversation like this is what makes KPFA different. Since 1949, this radio station has lived or died by the decisions of people like you to donate. We don't take ads. We don't take underwriting. We don't operate from the patronage of the wealthy elite. What does that mean? First thing, it means we're not worried about offending patrons or advertisers or underwriters or whatever you want to call them. Wealthy people who don't want to be associated with controversial or radical material. That can have a chilling effect on what you actually cover. The second thing it means is we're not trying to squeeze down big ideas into short sound bites that are airing in between commercial breaks, like so much of the broadcast media in this country is, which means you can actually have a conversation about a new idea or set of ideas and explore them in depth in a way that is made almost impossible by the format. You know, you certainly can't do that within the time constraints on TikTok. It's not happening between commercial breaks on cable news. And if you learn things here at KPFA, if you've had a lot of aha moments, if you find yourself telling people about something you heard on KPFA, then we need you to understand you are the engine that makes that possible. Now, we got 3 minutes left to put some fuel in the engine. You know what? Let's say it's an electric motor. We have 3 minutes to put some electrons in the engine. KPFA.org, 1-800-439-5732. $1,000 in challenge money on the line. The book we've been discussing is $120, and we have 300 to go. So 3 people pledging for a copy of the book would get us over the top. It pops up first thing in the featured box when you go to kpfa.org to donate. If you are someone who needs a phone line in order to make your donation, we have good news for you and bad news for us. Every single phone line coming into KPFA is open right now. 1-800-439-5732. That's 1-800-HEY-KPFA, or online at www.kpfa.org. All right, an anonymous donation from Berkeley has moved us $25 closer, so we are at $275 to go. But we are down to 1 minute and 45 5 seconds left to raise it. I want to, in that brief span of time, particularly encourage you to become a KPFA sustainer if you haven't already. That means you sign up for a regular monthly donation at KPFA. For the book we've been discussing this hour, it would take $12 a month or more. I think a lot of people talk themselves out of doing this because $12 a month doesn't feel that meaningful. If you're going to do something for your radio station, it should feel big. It should feel momentous. But actually having a steady stream of small donations coming in is more useful to KPFA than a big lump sum that we get once and don't know if we'll ever see again. It's something we can count on, something we can plan around. It's money coming in when we're not in the middle of a fund drive. It's money to get us back on our feet if there's some kind of calamity or catastrophe, if an earthquake or a wildfire takes out our transmitter on Grizzly Peak. So, $12 a month right now, we would get to count the 12-month value of that donation, which would be $144 towards our challenge. 2 donations at that level would take us over the top. And it would be enough to get you the thank you gift we've been discussing. KPFA.org, 1-800-439-5732. And while I've been talking, people have been donating. Thank you, Sonoma. Thank you, Antioch. We are now $150 away from making the challenge. 20 seconds left on the clock here at KPFA 94.1 FM in Berkeley, KPFB 89.3 FM at Berkeley, KFCF 88.1 FM in Fresno, K248BR 97.5 FM in Santa Cruz, K232FZ 94.3 FM in Monterey. We're online around the world at KPFA.org.